Let's move on then to our next discussion, which will be government-approved product lists. Our esteemed group will highlight some of the main barriers to doing business with the government, the federal government, and they will also include those pro tips for removing those barriers. We have 4 speakers. We will have 4 individual presentations, so at least within the room. We'll hold our questions until the very end. Of course, if you'd like to email them in, reverseindustrytraining@gsa.gov. We'll welcome your questions. But our 4 topics to be discussed are consolidation of government-approved product lists, how to ensure you'll have proper procurement language for specifying APL-listed equipment and qualified integrators for your PACS project, and a checklist for success, more to a good system than an APL listing, and finally, new construction considerations. So if you would, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Roy Hayes of Systems Engineering to get us started.
Good morning. Lars said that I was supposed to keep this entertaining and wake you up, but I don't know how we can make an approved product list that entertaining, but I'm going to do my best by keeping it short. It's awful early in the morning, too, because I normally don't start my day this early, so it's nice to see what the morning looks like. But what I found was a bunch of traffic. But thank you again for allowing me to come up and talk about approved product list. Again, I'm Roy Hayes. I'm the CEO of System Engineering. We are a security and integration firm. Been around for about 30 years. Support a lot of major government agencies as a prime and as a sub. What I'm going to talk about is approved product list, and primarily the 2 major ones that you hear about is the Department of Defense Unified Capabilities Approved Product List and the GSA Approved Product List. And I'll tell you the situation with that as we go through it, how this causes some confusion in the marketplace, especially when it comes to procuring systems. The guiding policies for the GSA APL PACS system in particular is HSPD 12 FIPS 201-2 and the NITS Special Publication 800-16. You can read these, so I'm not going to go through them all, but these are the guiding policies that we look at when we're looking at APL PACS systems. First thing I thought I wanted to do is simply kind of define what a PACS is. I mean, a lot of times we talk about it. The acronym is the Physical Access Control System. So you see in that, and these are not all the components, but these are the major components. Basically the lock, the reader, the controller, and the server. The server has information that goes to the controller. The controller makes a decision whether you can get in or out based on information it receives from the server. And of course, the reader is used for the credential, just to check whether you can get access to who, where, and when. So when we're talking about access control, in the case of physical access control, we're talking about controlled spaces, okay? In this case, we're talking about, in green, we're talking about a controlled space. Yellow, we're talking about a limited, and red, we're talking about an exclusion. And we're going to talk about what that really means in the next slide, and basically what it takes to access those controlled spaces. So when we're talking about controlled space, green, we're talking about one-factor authentication. And normally we're talking about the cake, the authentication key, the card authentication key. We want to make sure the card is not a duplicate and it's an actual card. So something you have, which is the cake. The next one is what we call limited, which is two-factor authentication, where now we're talking about the cake on the card, and we're also talking about the PIN that allows you to open the container to get the digital certificate. And the third is the exclusion area, where we're talking about the card, the cake, we're talking about the digital certificate, and a biometric feature, normally your fingerprint. So what is the problem? The problems are many, but I listed a few here. An agency requires only PACS off their APL list. A lot of agencies carry their own APL list, especially components of DoD. And if that product is not on their approved product list, they don't want it installed. And that becomes a problem because a lot of the PACS systems, most of the PACS systems that's on the APL are not on these agencies' approved product lists. The other thing is what criteria did they use to get on the approved product list? What it could lead to and what it does lead to is inconsistent validations. The APL list for GSA for the PACS system, they go through a stringent testing through the FIPS 201 evaluation program. When you take PACS from another system or another APL that does not go to that criteria, there's no assurance that you can go through, that system had went through the same rigorous test that GSA APL does. And that leads to a problem. The other problem is that now that the PACS is really considered an IT system, you have the problem with certification and accreditation and inherent in those artifacts that allow you to operate on individual agency networks. So how do we get around that? How can we improve that? Here are a few suggested ways that we think that might work. We will look at PACS from the APL being a flow down, meaning that the PACS on the APL will be the minimum standard. And then if an agency requires any more uniqueness to that, it can add some restrictions, but you start off with at least accepting that the GSA APL PACS be the standard. We've thought about an opportunity to develop a memorandum of understanding so that you can, so some of these agencies that have their own approved product list can accept GSA approved products, PACS, on their approved products. Reciprocity, looking at agencies allowing them to receive it either through a reciprocity agreement that these systems, if they're used here, you don't have to go through a vetting process twice. Really what we want to do is work towards a consolidation of the government-approved product list. And that's a long task because every agency probably has their own requirements. But that would be a goal that we would like to see happen. And we also would like to work with the procurement officials to make sure they have a better understanding of how these APLs work and how to harmonize those with the APL on the GSA website. So what are my takeaways? If we can adopt some of those things or some of those policies that we've talked about in terms of reciprocity, in terms of having the flow down from PACS, we think it will save time and money. We think it will simplify acquisitions. It definitely will reduce procurement and vendor confusion. But probably the major point is that we want to ensure consistent and vetted process in achieving the required security, because security is a continuing, evolving threat to the federal agencies. And as such, FICAM allows us to address those threats because we have evolution and we have a path forward to address threats with the FICAM process and with the GSA approved product that may not be available when individual agencies try to put products on their list. I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues next, and we're going to take questions after this. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Is everyone up? And Adam? How was the commute this morning? A breeze, right? Thanks, everyone. Appreciate everyone's time this morning and the opportunity for us to share this information. I think it's a great learning opportunity for both industry and for government. And let me get this over to the beginning. Again, I'm Stafford Mahfouz. I'm with one of the manufacturers. Good. Yep.
Here we go. Ah, there we go. Sorry about that, folks.
That's right.
There you go, sir.
There we go. Today, what we're going to deal with when we look at from a procurement perspective, there are a lot of moving parts when we look at the PACS system, access control, and initially, access control systems were designed for essentially working with a lot of the legacy cards that we've seen over the years, which also presents some of the challenges that we've seen, because today, depending on what phase you're in terms of implementing a fully compliant solution, there are going to be some things that need to be addressed. And so that's some of the things we're going to focus on today. Again, my name is Stafford, and I'm with Software House Johnson Controls. We are a manufacturer of access control technologies. And when we talk about compliance, typically what we find, and this, when we look back at the very beginning stages of when HSPD 12 came out, there were a lot of moving parts. And initially the focus was on the credential, right? And then along comes being able to have the credential work with the physical access control system. And the biggest aspect is being able to do a challenge response of the government issued credential with the PACS system. And so as it goes, we announce that this has to be done. And then of course, along comes the compliance part of things. And some of this information is really redundant, because each one of us that gets up here, we're going to point to a lot of the NIST publications that have come out, and a lot of great information in a lot of different areas. GSA has done a tremendous job in helping to educate where we are in the process. And so and it's overwhelming, right? Because there's so many different links that you can go to and information that you can pull up. And what I would suggest is that nothing greater than being able to do hands-on. So if you have a system that is in a particular stage of implementation, or you know that you need to get from point A to point B, I would suggest getting, of course, with your IT folks and getting with your physical security team, and start to put together a test platform, a working platform that you can start to look at what are all the moving pieces that I'm going to have to implement. And that's always a good place to start. Because obviously, as pointed out before, there are a lot of policies that we've seen out there and that we're familiar with. You know, the idmanagement.gov is a great place to go in terms of looking for guidance on procurement. Also, when we look at a lot of the elements that need to be put in place, obviously we need to look at different people within our organization that can help, that are educated on some of these areas that maybe we're not a subject matter expert on. And I know a lot of us as manufacturers are willing to assist our customers and be able to help provide whatever assistance from a technical perspective as well, and aiding with your, with your IT folks. And so what are some of the pitfalls that we've seen out there, some common things that have caused some problems? Usually the statement of work that are being put out there from a procurement perspective are getting better and better, and they're really targeting and hitting on the things that the systems need to do in order to be compliant. And how many of us with our facilities still have legacy cards, right, that we still have to deal with? So there needs to be a plan to let's phase those cards out, because ultimately, while we all have a PIV credential that's been issued, and contractors that may be working within your organization have a PIV credential or even a PIV-I credential, it's the visitor card, and it's also the maybe a contractor card where someone's not eligible for a PIV credential. And so really think about, what do I need, how many credentials do I need to plan for and be able to procure? Because the newer credentials that are PIV compliant that need to work on the system, think about this. The moment I turn the readers on in my system to become compliant, you can't use a traditional non-PIV card on that reader. It's not going to work. We look at the various components. Again, the PACS systems have been around for years, and we as manufacturers have been trying to do all that we can to use that existing infrastructure and to make it work. But as new criteria is introduced into compliance, we as manufacturers have to be able to make our systems compliant. There may be some firmware changes, there may be software changes, there may be hardware changes. And so, staying educated from us as manufacturers to you as an end user to understand, okay, well, I know my system is compliant today, but there are new test criteria that have now been introduced where we have to test the systems further to mitigate any challenges. We talk about the PIV card reader. Some things that we've seen, a system was installed, the reader was installed properly, but the reader was not put in the correct mode. And so I've gotten calls, and I know some of our other manufacturers have gotten calls where they say, hey, the system was installed based on my statement of work, and it appears to be compliant, but the card reader wasn't put into a challenge response mode. As a matter of fact, in the proper mode, if I'm doing for example, a dual factor authentication where I have to insert a card, use my PIN to authenticate, the reader was actually set to where the PIN is stored in the access control system versus using the PIN on the card. So while it might seem like a minor thing, you're supposed to be challenging the credentials that are written to the card. And so the end user had to go back and ask the integrator that installed the system to reconfigure the system. When we talk about, I talked about this earlier, there are different credentials that are now being introduced into the marketplace to where these can be procured for visitor type end users and start to remove these other credentials that are non-compliant. Some other common things that we've seen, the integrator just didn't follow the statement of work. We've seen that happen. Some other things that we've seen happen where the system is being deployed, but the server that has to go out to the internet in order to the Federal Bridge and check the certificates, for some reason, IT wasn't included in the conversation, and they go, oh, by the way, before we can let this go out to the internet, we're going to have to make sure it meets all the FISMA compliances and mitigate any cyber-related issues. So, planning ahead and getting IT involved is also a really important thing. We've also seen some other common things. The RFPs were good all the way through, and there was like one minor thing that was missed. So being able to, again, plan ahead and mitigate those things are important. Some takeaways, again, OMB 1111, 800.116 version 1, which is now addresses some of the issues that I was talking about earlier on the cards. And when you look at the integrators, when you look at the selection process, we've seen some cases where integrators were chosen to implement a solution, but they hadn't gone through the certification. They're not listed on the APL. And I'd like to compliment Lars and his team, Lars over here, because they do a great job in the certification programs to assure that integrators are certified. And so, we received the call where an award was made to an integrator, and we have integrators all over the country. And depending on where these systems are going in, sometimes you don't have the expertise in remote areas, but it's important that during the selection process, when you put a procurement out and you go through the assessment of, well, who's responding, what are their qualifications, and making sure that if they're not qualified, they have someone on their team as part of that implementation that's going to be able to assure that the system is installed. And so what do you do when an award has been made? And this is, unfortunately, this customer, we had to pull together and find some additional resources to assist them and to make sure that the system got implemented. So those are some things to try and head off, before you get that far down the road. Again, I mentioned the ID management website is a good place to go. I would think I don't know, each agency and DoD site varies when they look at implementing a system, but trying to do as much as you can in terms of having an engineering design evaluated before perhaps the final selection is made to assure that the integrator knows what they're talking about or they know what they're doing would be very useful. Again, questions and answers are going to be done later on, but those are some of the common things that we've seen, and I'll leave it at that and turn it over to our next hitman.
I'm Rob Zivney, and I'm going to be talking about there's more to good PACS than an APL listing, and I'm trying to address some of the expectation gaps that you have to solve. I, too, have more than 40 years of industry experience with building automation systems, computerized, and security systems. In fact, I was involved when my hair was a lot less gray in putting in one of the very first computerized security systems in the Fort Worth Federal Office Building with GSA. So you've got a nice reputation that goes way back. We used slide projectors then as part of the system instead of these. But anyhow, I've been involved with both the industry groups here that are putting this presentation on today, and I welcome the opportunity. First things first, many elements of a security in PACS are really out of scope for PIV. That's one of your challenges. Therefore, an approved products list does not validate the entire PIV or the PACS. Most PACS expectations need to be spec'd out. Specifying being on the APL alone is not enough. So let's look what's in scope and what's not. Let me give you a definition. It really comes from a different NIST publication on building automation systems. And a PACS is a control breach in an otherwise secure perimeter, and that's a volumetric type perimeter. You've got to worry about the doors and the windows and the ceilings and the roof hatches and the basements, and however you could get in and out, you got to have that complete security system. PACS historically sets that expectation of that's what you're getting just by using the words. When PIV is involved, it only talks about one sub-element of that. The other elements of a PACS would include the door and the gates. That's out of scope. The door status monitoring. I mean, after all, you could prop a door open, and that's fine for most of the PIV documents that we deal with today. So you got to make sure that you're monitoring for the integrity of that control perimeter. Any kind of alarm suppression when the door is supposed to be penetrated by a person because they put a card there, that's authorized. You suppress the alarm. If someone props it open, you don't suppress it. So a lot of those things go into a PACS, and we in industry just assume that that is what goes with the PACS. And when you see that words, a lot of the procurement process and the others that are involved assume they're getting all of these things, the central control by the guards and what they can do, reports, configuration capabilities. But since PIV is focused on just a subset of that, and unless the specification for that expected PACS is written thoroughly, you don't necessarily have a successful field implementation. The servers and the distributed processors or the controllers are in scope. In some extent, the readers are too, because they do the end-to-end testing, and they're in scope and they're touched upon because that's how we do some of the certificate validation. So what are the functions of a PACS? I like to say it's the 4 A's. Authentication, that's in scope. Are you the enrollee, the person that someone else enrolled in the system and issued a card? But the who goes where when part, out of scope. Alarms, if the system's compromised, rejected attempts, out of scope. any of the administration aspects of who manages the PACS and the capability for you to manage it on site, reports, the configuration of the roles perhaps for the who goes where when, overrides, any ability to readjust things as you might move a door or a wall or reconfigure, all of that kind of capability, somebody's got to spec it. Let's look what NIST is saying. For many years now, the title of a key document that mentions PACS and PIV together was a recommendation for the use of PIV credentials in a PACS. And now, as of this summer, is simply guidelines for the use of PIV credentials in facility access. A little bit of change. But what they say in there is real instructive. Authorization, i.e. granting permission within a PACS for an identified person to pass access control points, is a critical security function, but it's out of scope. It's out of scope for the PIV system. Other out-of-scope functions include area protection, intrusion detection, egress, monitoring, and tracking, other than access points and enforcement of those access control decisions. This document, SP 800-116, if you reference it, you got to know that it does not address the integration of PACS with other facility-centric information IT systems. If you want those things, you get to spec it. So how does PIV do authentication? In the beginning, we looked at the model of a desktop PC as all the documents were developed. And they mainly looked at the readers that were just the indoor type with a little open slot to put the card in that were used in a very controlled environment indoors. They used contact readers. But PACS, as a rule, have used contactless because they're often outdoors. They have vandalism issues. They've got a lot of other reasons to be sealed and tight, and they often use a proximity or wave and go type of solution. But now the new trend is to focus on cryptography and PKI. So we've got to assimilate that into the modern day PACS. With PIV, they do an unusual approach to biometrics. It's not all the commercial and industrial traditional ways. They do kind of use a fingerprint and they allow some iris, but they do it in specific ways. So it's a very different way than industry normally does it in terms of how it's implemented. And that needs to be understood when specifying it. We can't just say fingerprint biometrics. It's got to be a unique way to do it. What's important to understand is the card carries the payloads. It carries the certificates. It's like a notary public. It's a digital notary public. A third party is loading the certs on the card for us, and they're issuing it, and they're vouching for your identity between two other parties. That's that third party approach. So it's really a digital notary public if you want to think about it or explain it to someone else. So the certs not only give you the ability to authenticate, but they're the basis for the interoperability. We talk a lot about interoperability, and sometimes we over-expect that means all the various components work together in every possible way. No. But it does mean that the certs can be used interchangeably from site to site, because that is what the APL tested. So when I do present the card, it would be interoperable, at least to that one purpose. So an agency can read another agency's card, at least for the mandatory portions. There's a lot of options, so you got to make sure that if one agency has an option and another one doesn't, that wouldn't necessarily be interoperable. Specs allow PACS to share that cert in enterprise systems as you move from site to site as well, at least to make sure that that certificate could be read in a predefined way. The APL ensures that. What they test when we send a system to is that they test end-to-end that when that card is presented to a reader in a PACS and it is processed to make sure that you do check that certificate end-to-end and it is granting access at that door from that reader, it does verify that that was done and only that was done, more or less. So the systems are tested and proved for specific components for a given manufacturer. If I support 3 or 4 different readers in my system and I only submit 2 of them, then I can't put another reader that might work. But if only the 2 that I submitted with my system to be tested at the APL were actually in that list for that test, I can only use those 2. If another manufacturer submitted a different reader that I support, different than the one I submitted, and his is on the list and it's been on the APL, I still can't use it with my system. So I can only use those that are in my record with my system for end-to-end testing. So there's really no guarantee that I could switch components out between one manufacturer system and another from the APL. listing. There is not that kind of interoperability. It just means that for the system configuration that's documented in testing, that will work end to end to read a card properly. The enterprise interoperability is really done by moving those certificates either by the person you see in the lower left hand as he goes from wherever he receives his card and goes out to a site. He can take that and register in the PACS. The PACS doesn't know he's coming at first. You have to give him the who goes where, when authorization, and that's done site by site. You can download it if you connect it over the cloud or some other kind of wiring infrastructure, but that can be done. By the same token, enterprise connections can be made, and they also can use a certificate authority and certificate validation service kind of as a little add-on aspect to each of the PACS, and then they can read those PKI certs between them. So that can be done on an enterprise-wide basis. Let's talk about what we call the CAK, the Card Authentication Certificate. It's really important for PACS because that's what gives us the wave and go method. It's the contactless. Remember, PACS are associated with contactless. LACS, logical access, has always used contact. And so that's one of our challenges we've got to really understand. The most common mechanism for access control in any PACS anywhere has always really been contactless. So it's best for the outdoors and challenging environments. The slotted readers are subject to vandalism, chewing gum, paper, weather, salt sea spray, all kind of things. The contactless Chewed, something that's going away, the contactless Chewed is a number system that was very fast because it used that wave and go and it worked with the contactless systems. But it doesn't use certs. So now we're moving on from what we did in the first decade of PIV implementation. It's been deprecated. Don't procure those if you can avoid it. The contactless cake is slower because it has the certs in it. It just doesn't work as fast. But it is certainly more secure. Not all PIV cards have a cake. It's optional. DOD has about 40% of the cards out there, and they're not putting the cake on yet for maybe another year. And so that's just something that needs to be considered when you think about the ideal way to do a PACS with some technologies that are not mandated. And also, you can't use this with bio, and I'll say a little bit more about that because it's only contact only. I got a question for you. Show of hands coming. Since PIV in the biometric implementation requires you to put a card in a reader, contact card, you got to put your finger on a platen, and you got to enter a PIN into that reader. I want to see a show of hands. How many think that's three-factor authentication? For biometric, when you do put the card in the reader, put your finger on there, and then also type in a PIN number, how many of you think it's three-factor authentication? I see a good show of hands.
Are you saying it's in combination with the card auth key or just...
I'll get there. Thank you, Steve. The way the rules are actually written, how many of you think it's two-factor authentication? How many think one-factor? Okay, Steve's got it and a couple others. Why is that? Well, that's just the way it was developed under the hood, but it's the kind of thing you have to think about because it was originally evolved from what was a contact basis. I won't get into the details. I was asked not to, but it is a single factor. But be aware of that. We can talk about it in the Q&A session. But it is typically, now I could go and enhance my reader to maybe do some additional things to make it work three-factor, but that's not in any of the spec documents, and so therefore it wouldn't necessarily be tested out to work any other way. PACS, in some ways, are essentially limited to one factor. If you look at the top, and this is right out of the NIST document, SP 89116, the definitive one, it shows you 1, 2, and 3 factors available, but that's only on the contactless side, which is probably best used at a desktop PC. When you're into the contact on top, contactless, you probably can't see it below, but it's really just saying there's nothing but one-factor authentication mechanisms. And we need that contactless wave and go to a great extent to get people through doors and gates a lot quicker. There is one version down below. It's two-factor. You may not be able to see it, but we don't know of anybody that's using that yet. So when you think about the 1, 2, and 3 factors as you go to higher and higher security, this is something you have to contemplate to spec it right to get what you need at the right place.
Which one is that? We can't read it.
Okay, down below, Steve, it says OCC auth is 2-factor.
Thank you.
Yeah, the CHUID and the symmetric cake and the PKI cake is 1-factor. We don't have the combinations with PIN or biometric that give us what we need really for most PACS implementations with the needed contactless. It's only in the contact. Now, maybe as you get further and you're coming into a computer room and that's the most secure area where you need 3-factor, that might work. But you just still got to plan and think about it. The path is not always clear. In the real world, you don't only move from unrestricted to controlled to limited to exclusion. In fact, some of the guidelines say I can only have 1 factor at each of these, and they assume I make the right path. Because walls get moved around, things get changed. It's more of an industry best practice to have 2 factors where you're going into a higher area requiring 2 factors instead of just 1. Assume you went through the right path that got you there. And also, this is what we see in the real world. Sometimes something is of a higher security situation, like exclusion, that you should just have 3 factors there immediately. You don't always go through that progression. So there's a lot more thinking that may be outlined in some of our guidance documents. Interoperability challenges. Not all agencies use the same card capabilities. I said before, DoD doesn't because it's been an option up to now. So if one agency uses a contactless reader with their cake, but another agency is visiting that doesn't have it on their card, do they get in? Yeah, it won't see it, won't recognize it. So you have to have maybe some special escorts, administrative, and extra cost. Card revisions may not always be backward compatible. When I add a new feature in a card, my existing PACS and readers may not know what to do with it. So you may have to upgrade the reader. And right now, as we're moving from the old CHUID readers to the new, more of a cryptographic PKI solutions being mandatory, you might have to upgrade the entire PACS as we look forward here, or major upgrades to it or replacement. There really is no full PACS procurement specification for all those expectations that go with the PACS. So, that's going to be a challenge to put those kind of documents together. We do have some degree of a reader specification in the test specs of the APL. That's helpful, but it's not complete. We talk about being part of IT, and it's real critical to understand that PACS are IT plus. They're really a process control because of the controllers and the readers they use. This kind of process control you might see in industrial applications. They're real-time versus batch. They've got to be instant. We've always tried to get people through the door quick. They use distributed processing in case you lose the internet or the connection to the cloud. They always have some capability operating right there in that black box. They're optimized for performance. They're not optimized for running big batch processes, but for getting you through the door. And they're rugged for reliability. These go in unusual environments. And they include alarm monitoring and intrusion. Even though it's out of scope for PIV, it's expected. They're all built in. And they're very secure. And they still, today, they're coming from industry with the card validation services and certificate authority support to go with them. You can expect that, but you got to ask for it. Now, let me talk about some of the power that you have on the authorization end, the out-of-scope part, for visitors. And we're seeing people being creative. If you want to save costs with unmanned stations, you could have a self-registration kiosk with 1, 2, or 3 factors there. Someone shows up, they authenticate, so, okay, they are who they say they are. But if you have pre-registered your guest with a special role that says a guest, maybe he gets into that door to get into the first level of security within. Another one is maybe we're going within an agency. Because the information about the agency you're a member of is in the card, perhaps it looks at that for the authorization part along with your authentication. If that's okay, it might let you in. You've done a little bit of both. So there's some clever things we can do, but you don't get it unless you spec it. It doesn't come with just being in the APL. So, checklist real quick. Start by defining your security system's objectives. That's the output, starts with the input. Do a risk management assessment. Then think about the volumes you're trying to protect, because there's a lot of different pathways to get in. Assign a level of protection required to each area or volume. Each perimeter, whether it's uncontrolled, controlled, limited, or exclusion. And then you select the protection that you need for that, not just the readers, but whatever else you need, and whether it's going to be manned or not. That goes into the equation. Meet with your IT folks up front. One of the biggest mistakes we ever make is we don't bring security and IT together until the very end, and then they don't even have a relationship. If we bring them together in the beginning at the site and start working, not just here in the Beltway, but at the site, that solves a lot of problems down the road. They can set goals and policies and determine challenges up front together. They talk about FSMA, which is really a site-specific requirement that they have to meet themselves, and they can do it as a team in any kind of environmental issues. Write the security system specification that's complete for all the PACS expectations. The good news is the GSA schedules have been doing security systems and PACS for a long time. So they've got vendors that know how to do all that, and they have products on that list. So start there, narrow it down by filtering it out for systems that are also on the APL with all the right components that go with that for the component requirements. Then to define the site requirements. What goes where, when? Which kind of reader goes at the 1, 2, 3 factor locations? How do you want it to work operationally? Do you want somebody to be able to get in a door if they've been rejected once or not? So there's a lot of different kind of things that happen. Address how those cards get registered when they first show up. You have to take that card when they authenticate themselves and assign them to a role for where they can go when. That happens on site, and it usually based on site policy. So you'll have to work that into the spec if you want to get that in the bid. Establish your acceptance criteria. That should come first, right with the risk management. So that now you can test against what it was that you wanted to achieve. And then you issue the procurement documents. So your takeaways. Security is why you procure PACS. If you want security, you need to spec it. Being on the APL is not enough because security is out of scope. Thank you.
All right, good morning to everyone in the audience and in our virtual audience. Thanks again for allowing us to be part of this program. My name is Tony Damalas. I'm with Signet Technologies, and Signet Technologies is the Federal Solutions Group of Convergent Technologies. For this short presentation, I will briefly review what governs the delivery of a PACS system in a new construction scenario. I'll also review some terms and some definitions of some teams that go into developing the governing documents and the implementation of the system, and give you some examples of how sometimes it goes wrong. Let's look at this little skit or cartoon for a second and analyze how it can become an analogy for what I'm basically discussing. The gentleman with the hard hat has a set of plans and specifications, and he's running towards City Hall. In our analogy here, City Hall is the owner or the agency who's buying the system, and the contractor who's providing these plans and specs for his contract is saying, I've got it all, and once the contract is issued, then that's what I'm going to go by. In the meantime, there are other organizational elements or personnel making up a task force, OMB, GSA, others that are saying, don't forget this, don't forget that. Make sure that this is in your regulations to be compliant, the USB 801.16, et cetera. However, once a contract is let and the owner has contracted with a VAR or VAR or an integrator to accomplish what he's hopefully going to be receiving, then that becomes the governing documents, and change orders might have to be issued. Other things that would drive costs up will have to be brought into play. So in the commercial world, this is always the case where I'm putting in what was being designed and what was specified, and if it's not there up front, it's kind of late to not go through the change order or the modification process. Same thing applies here. In our world of developing a PACS that meets FICAM compliance. If it's not in the plans and specs, which we'll define, it'll be a little bit more difficult to accomplish it as efficiently. So what are plans and specs? We heard many of our previous presenters discuss it and bring it up and reference it. Well, the terms plans and specs, when used collectively like this, plans and specs, is basically referring to the complete set of documents associated with the written requirements and the blueprints or the drawings that go into developing the construction project to completion that we're discussing. So it's a term that implies the governing documents and the rules that need to be followed to implement the solution. The specifications specifically are the written requirements that are going to describe the work being performed. It could actually go into detail of what products they're looking to expect for this project, services, performance work statements, general scopes of work. These are the written documents that are referred to as the specifications for the projects. What's important here is that there are many contractors under various levels, and we'll show a diagram in a second about how there's a Tier 1, Tier 2 structure. Those plans and specifications were meant for the whole project, and therefore they were meant for all contributors or stakeholders or integrators being a delivery of some service for that organization. What it binds them to that project is the legal contract that they've created with their first tier up contractor. If a prime contractor, for example, issues a contract and he does not state in his specifications, your portion will be provided in compliance with per plans and specifications, then the only thing that subcontractor is liable for is whatever's in his contract with his next tier up. And when the prime contractor shows to the subcontractor, you failed to deliver this particular part that was written in the plans and specs, he's going to come back and say, well, you did include that in your contract. So in your general specifications and written documents, make sure that you have the language that says all applicable references to these plans and specs must be included in your contract documents with your sub-tier organizations to assure that it's their responsibility that any lower contractor involved has to also review the plans and specifications to be sure that he doesn't cause a deviation. The term per plans and specifications is a very, very common term that we have in our industry. It's kind of like a two-edged sword. And in one sense, it's a very good catch-all phrase. Just do it according to plans and specifications. And the negative of that is that many, many details in the plans and specifications are sometimes ignored. They might be considered irrelevant or not necessarily applicable for this project. But at the same time, those that do take it seriously add costs to cover those details that other contractors may say not applicable. So you're in the process of trying to compare bid responses, apples and apples, and the pricing are different. And some of the cause for that is one person integrated the details of those plans and specifications to his project. Others looked at it at a very, very high level, knew generally what they were trying to do, but didn't necessarily include those things that he thought were not necessarily applicable. So per plans and specifications is a two-edged sword. It covers you, but it could also create some costs associated with covering all those bases that you may or may not have wanted, in your project to keep the costs down. So make sure that what you provide is necessary and applicable. Anything excess and later the term per plans and specs apply, then they're going to have to be included and covered somehow. What puts together the solution that we call plans and specifications and the design team that creates that? The owner, in this particular case, is going to contract primarily with an architect who is in a sense, the conductor of all of the various specialties that go into completing the design. There are specialty areas like civil and structural consultants, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, plumbing, and others. What I wanted to kind of point out here is that we are now implementing new systems that subject matter experts may or may not have had an opportunity to participate. So where in this particular typical hierarchy diagram for consultants. Is there a consultant for ICAM or FICAM? Does the architect know what it's all about? Does the electrical engineer know what it's all about? There's no requirements. The only real requirements is the certification that is requested for those that configure and implement the system, which generally comes into play at the implementation stage of the project. When a tech goes out to do the final turn on, they usually send out the CSEIP engineer that's certified to configure that system. But how do we know that that system that he's about to integrate and configure has all the right components? That begins again in the design stage. And when it was submitted for approval, did it bypass certain key elements so it got its rubber stamp approved, but yet there's some ICAM or FICAM faults in that set of documents. So knowing that that happens in the real world, I've seen my share of it, and I've been doing security and access control for about 45 years, and I've seen a lot. The example of an RCDD is introduced here, and in one of my last slides, I'll go into a little bit more of that. But an RCDD is a Registered Communications Distribution Designer. It's the person who is supposed to review the networks and all the communication infrastructure that goes into a project. You can only show so much on a blueprint. The actual details of the switches, the controllers, et cetera, go into this project, have to be configured properly to work to the scale that you expect. And as a consequence, a subject matter expert in that field is required to review that and put his stamp on it. And the DoD actually references this, and I'll show that in the last slide, where they expect it for every one of their DoD projects for unified construction is required to provide an RCDD certified submission for that communication package. So as a hint for maybe a future discussion, may not be a bad idea to include a CSEIP or an equivalent subject matter expert as part of the review of the FICAM solution being submitted for approval, so at least you can catch the potential problems before you approve the set of drawings for implementation. Once it's implemented and it's not done correctly, then many times the owner and the contractor and the specialty companies are looking at each other saying, what do we do? And it, of course, introduces delays and additional costs. So this is the design team that's made up of various consultants. Once the selection of the contractor is made, then you have another relationship between an owner and a prime contractor. Prime contractor being the first one responsible for the entire project, and also referred to as a general contractor. There are many general contractors, but in a position of deployment, the first one under the owner is referred to as the prime contractor. Contractors beneath the first one are referred to as Tier 1 subs. And as you can imagine, the one below the Tier 1 and is responsible to Tier 1 is another subcontractor in the Tier 2 category. And there's also Tier 3, Tier 4, depending on what subject matter experts are needed for what particular role. The comment that I made earlier about making sure that the wording and the language of what's in the plans and specs are also observed and followed by the various contractors on the project. This is where a Tier 1 may create a contract with a Tier 2, a prime may create a contract with a Tier 1, and unless specifically written that he must provide a pass-along or a pass-through of the references in the document that govern the construction of the project or in the contract he's created, there's a high probability that if there is a conflict, it'll be a stall of the project because the Tier 2 has to work out the problems with Tier 1, and that he's going to say, that's not my job. It was not in my contract. So the importance, again, of referencing the plans and specs in various tiers going down. The negative of all this, of course, from a financial perspective, is that you could have a Tier 2 subcontractor be the specialty integrator providing the FICAM PACS solution. And as a consequence, he's selling it to Tier 1, and Tier 1 is selling it to the prime, and the prime is selling it to the owner. So costs sometimes are padded to cover their operational costs as it goes up the line. So this is why sometimes what you might think a particular GSA price for something might be advertised to be doesn't become the exact price you pay for it. Again, based on how you structure the cost and financial aspects of the contract, you've got these layers that are impacting that price. Let me give you 4 examples of things that I took directly out of real specifications that came across my desk. The first one quotes, FIPS 201 readers shall be able to read but not be limited to DeskFire and iClass cards. In short, this is not an accurate statement because FIPS 201 readers are not necessarily designed to be FICAM compliant while reading DeskFire and iClass cards. So speaking for an integrator, how am I supposed to bid this job? If I bid it in a low-end approach where I'm providing DeskFire or iClass cards and not the ability to do the FICAM compliant authentication process with the PIV cards, then I am possibly different in apples and apples comparison. Apples and oranges becomes the scenario, and pricing differs. And the readers that I'm providing, if I turn them off from the FICAM mode and allow them to read other cards, and there are readers out there that are designed to be able to read multiple technologies, then I basically destroyed the high assurance mode of the FICAM reader and created low assurance technology to be introduced to that reader, and I've defeated the purpose. So the alternative there, I won't take the time to read it, but I give you some alternative language there that could be appropriate for a FIPS 201 reader and how it's supposed to react with a PIV card. Point 2, the required personal identity verification assurance level at each door shall be a mixture of little or no confidence. Obviously, it's referring to a Chew-it-only type reader and some confidence implying a PKI, K certificate, with the ability to require a PIN as a second factor at certain doors. Not realizing, of course, because he's not kept up to date with his plans and specification language, Chew-it authentication has been deprecated. And by asking for a little or no confidence, then the achievement of high assurance PACS, which means incorporating the certificate, challenge, and response, so forth, is defeated. Again, some alternative language is written below that kind of address this particular scenario. And there is some language that's recommended by GSA, and this particular part came from that. Number 3, another quote, the contractor will install a cipher lock on secure doors as designated in attachment. The CABA ePlex 5800 series FIPS 201 electronic push-button lock will be utilized. Of course, this is being in the spec is basically saying you will use this. But yet, in the earlier terminology of the spec, it says you shall have a compliant system. So what is an integrator to do? It's a catch-22. We know that all Chew-it readers have been deprecated and no longer on the APL. So again, some homework wasn't done properly, and the integration effort is going to be challenged. Some alternative language is, again, there, similar to the one I gave you, number 1. And the last example, contractors must be certified by the manufacturer and shall hold an HSPD 12 GSA certification as an approved vendor listed on the approved products list, or APL. What's the problem there? Contractors are not part of the GSA APL. It's manufactured products submitted in compliance with all the various documents discussing FICAM PACS, and it's tested accordingly, and contractors are to buy them or use them accordingly, but there is no APL listing that lists contractors. Contractor technicians are certified, not the companies themselves, but the individuals that attained the CSEIP certification, the Security Technology Alliance relationship with GSA, those individuals are certified, and they're on a different type of list. So the APL is for products. The personnel certification for subject matter expertise is something separate. And I provided some alternative language for that. Okay, what are the takeaways from our brief discussion on new construction PACS deployment. Obviously, you have to properly develop the plans and specs, and they should include the appropriate language and procurement language. It should not be conflicting. I gave you several examples where the language was conflicting to what you intended to do. So the opportunity of having the next recommendation, which is having a subject matter expert review that. And the way it normally works is that a contractor bids the job, he obtains the go-ahead to proceed, submits it to the engineering department, they design the solution. The person that may or may not have designed the solution may not have had a certification class yet. He may have overlooked something, and the submittal is prepared. It goes up the line. What I'm suggesting here is that we add one step. Add the opportunity for an internal individual within the organization that has the subject matter expertise for FICAM knowledge, review that solution, and if it was me in this particular case reviewing that for our company, I would take a look at not only the products being chosen, whether or not they're on the APL, how he's configured the solution for FICAM mode, and if I catch any issues, then it'll be corrected before it gets up the line. The problem is when it does go up the line, there's no guarantee that who's reviewing it knows that FICAM expertise, and he will stamp the project approved, and now you have that conflict between, well, you approved it, you have to pay for it. But it's not compliant, but you approved it, and you go back and forth. And this is where the small print comes into play, and the passing down of the terms of the contract to the various tiers, and it'll come into support. And then lastly, consider looking for evidence of qualified and or registered personnel certifying the job. In the actual submittal process, besides having an internal good idea to review it for the benefit of the contractor providing a quality solution, it's also something that can easily be looked at because the RCDD example is something that can easily be introduced, added to the submittal process so that when an engineer is looking at a recommended FICAM solution, he can look for something on the drawing that says it was reviewed by an appropriate subject matter expert and recommends the fact that this is an approved solution. And this is the last slide that kind of goes into some of the detail for what an RCDD is to give you that discussion support of what I'm saying. And down in red in the DOD requirement, page 3 of the DOD UFC, it actually reads the following. Ensure that the bid documents require an RCDD stamp on the contractor's telecommunications shop drawing submitted for approval. That's in every project, and the engineers look for that. So they themselves may not have to be subject matter experts, but they've got some reason to trust what was submitted. And I think we're going to be gathering up on the table for some questions for the entire 4 sessions. Thank you.
That blinding light and make us tell the truth one way or the other.
We're ready.
Oh, I gotta start.
Hit it, Steve.
Actually, I thought this was a really good panel, so congratulations and thank you very much. But I do have a question for Tony. So the way you presented it, it was a construction and implementation thing. And one of the things that I believe we're trying to get away from as we talk about it as an IT solution is to get away from this notion that when you build a building, that's when you build your PACS, okay, or your access control environment. Do you have any recommendations on how to mitigate the risk that these systems are going to change every 2 to 5 years? And how do we reduce the risk of you're locked in, you can't change because the wiring's wrong, your reader infrastructure's wrong. I don't know. I mean, pick a few things, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. It shouldn't be tied explicitly to the construction project of the building anymore. So can you help me understand?
Sure. There's certain things that we could do to address that in a positive way, and there are other things that we're simply stuck with. The A&E in the construction industry has been around for many, many years. There are thousands of contractors that are trained to do same things day in, day out. And when you tell them FICAM, they'll say, go away. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not what I'm interested in. My job is to do it per quote, per plans and specs. So every contractor that you will visit on a job doing a construction project will look at the plans and specs as the governing documents. That's the Bible for them. They're going to follow that. And if you say anything that is a good idea, you should consider this. It's important that. Anything you say, they're going to say, show me where it is in the plans and specs. If you cannot show them in the plans and specs, they're going to say, that's out of scope. That's not what I'm here to do. If you want to present something, go to the owner, go to the architect and engineer, and if he wants to accept that, he can then incorporate it into a modification or a change order, and then it becomes part of his responsibility to implement it. So that's, from an overall perspective, what you cannot do once the project is underway. What you could do to plan for that expansion is to design the solution with migration and upgrades in mind. For example, the conduit system that goes in, the cabling infrastructure that can go in, can be designed with the type of cable that can support multiple technologies. For example, today you can write a specification that can support WEGAN. WEGAN is a one-way communication, legacy technology, been around for many, many years, but it cannot support the two-way communication necessary for PKI challenge response. But there is cabling that can be specified in the project that can operate WEGAN technology, and then if it gets migrated later, it can operate RS-45 for OSP communication, OSTP. So as a consequence of thinking ahead, you can plan the implementation so that it can grow and upgrade without rip and replace. That's part of a migration strategy and a future-proofing scenario that unfortunately has to start with the architect and the engineers and the subject matter experts saying, this is what I want, do it. Otherwise, what ends up happening sometimes is the engineer puts in an empty conduit system. So the electrical contractor on the job puts in an empty conduit system, sized appropriately, turns the project over to the owner, and then the owner negotiates his own agreements with the systems integration people that provide the FICAM, and now they're using the empty conduit system, provide a separate, outside of the contract scope implementation. That's another way of doing it, but adds time to the project. I hope I answered your question, Steve.
Got a few virtual questions, and I'll come back over here if that's right. So question one, what is the technical guidance or standard regarding a full hardening protection of the TCP/IP, RS-485, or RS-232 PLC ports, which PACS manufacturers are still using? And then the comment is, as you may know, a reverse hacking by using those PLC ports, either RS-485 or RS-232, can take place.
I guess I'll give that a go. Is this thing turned on? Yeah, just tap it. Can you hear me? Test. Okay, the question deals with secure communication for either 232, 485, or TCP/IP. So the readers themselves are either communicating WEGAN to an interface module that then can secure the data from that module to the PACS panel, which is where you're dealing with some of the legacy WEGAN communication and you're using a converter. More of the newer solutions out there are the readers are securing, you have a secure channel on the 485 side where you're actually encrypting the data from the reader back to the controller. And most of the controllers out there are invoking some level of AES encryption, whether it's 128 or 256-bit encryption. So I don't know if that answered that person's question, but that's that.
Good morning. this is either for, I guess, Rob or Tony, but along the same lines, from an information security standpoint, are there or is there any central repository that might contain secure configuration guidance for those items that are on the approved products list, specifically meeting the requirements that are now set in FATARA that we have to meet before implementing any system, and preferably anything that would cover disastigs as far as monitoring of these devices, since they're now coming closer and closer to our active lands?
Tony, I'll take the first shot. I think that most successful government implementations start with a lot of communication between the potential suppliers, vendors, integrators, and what that particular government agency or site wants, because all those things you mentioned usually exceed what's in the APL, et cetera. As we tie into the IT system, that's good as far as the workstations, the servers, and out to the controllers that communicate that way. I think what Stafford was talking about is communication, all the way out to the reader might have been something that is outside of that because it's isolated by the controller. And they often are encrypted, available, but you need to specify that. And some of those requirements you talk about vary from agency to agency and often exceed even some of what you were saying.
We are mandated as part of the test criteria where the communication from the reader going back has to be encrypted. So if you have a system that's on the APL that passed compliance, that communication information is encrypted.
But not necessarily a specific specification. There's a lot of different ways to do that. It hasn't necessarily fallen into one definite specification like some of the other areas we deal with that are on the IT network itself. Some readers are actually on the IT network, depending on the configurations that the supplier is offering. So they would be a little bit more secure per your question. It might be a reader-controller combination that's an all-in-one unit that you might see in a low-density, widely distributed doors where there might be just one door in a building or something like that. I think we got about 3 minutes. 8.
So a few more questions. These are from Jorge Lozano, by the way. So another question from him is, cloning a PACS card is very simple, and many federal agencies are still using them. What is now the latest development in the federal agencies regarding the use of those PACS cards?
Don't use them.
Good answer.
There are credentials that are presented to so-called FICAM readers, and they work, but you have to ask the question, what mode is that reader in? If that reader mode is FICAM, it's supposed to challenge the reader to make sure that it is not cloned. And if a clone card is presented and it works, then obviously the FICAM mode is not operational because it should have rejected it in the first place. Now, as far as the use of those credentials in a FICAM scenario, then I would say that it's definitely possible to use those in a migration strategy because the government is practical in such that you can't go from A to B. That requires a lot of steps overnight. But if you suggest a strategy that says, today I'm going to be putting in new readers, I've got plenty of cards that I need to migrate out and bring in the use of the PIV card. While I'm doing that, they have to be operational. But at this point, I'm going to phase them out and then turn the readers back into full FICAM mode. So these credentials that we want to be not used anymore might have a short-lived benefit if they're in a planned migration strategy that ultimately the end goal is non-use. In other words, you're not going to use them anymore. That's the plan, but I have to get there in a very practical way. If there's a twisting of that language to say, that's all I have, that's what I'm going to use, then obviously you're going to be fighting City Hall in that sense, because you're not achieving the goal of high assurance if you tend to use an APL listed system in a non-FICAM way. And I have another presentation later on today that goes into more of this particular topic, and avoiding an APL listed system becoming a non-compliant implementation, that I'll go over some of these things.
To add what Tony was saying, the false sense of security is not just on prox cards, and this is why a free read of the CHUIT is no longer being allowed. You can also clone a PIV credential and be able to replay that number back to a reader that's not doing a challenge response. So just because you have PIV cards and you have readers that are compliant, unless you have an end-to-end implemented solution where you're doing the challenge response, then you still are vulnerable.
Okay, so thank you. First, I'd like to tie into your last section there, Stafford. It is, and what you talked about, it is indeed very deceptive for an end user who is not familiar with the process to believe that they are compliant because they can present a PIV card to a reader, and the reader pulls something off that card and it works. To someone who is not initiated with the details on how it works, says, "Oh, we're compliant. This was a piece of cake. What's all the fuss about?" That's a false sense of security, and it leaves a wide attack vector for an adversary. I'd like to tie back to what you stated in your sessions here also. And we started here with you that dealt with some field configuration that was done by someone who did not understand quite what they were doing. And there was also another session here from Rob, where you said that readers and certificate validation systems are tested as one, and that security is out of scope. There are some guides where you can find a list of people, a list of equipment, and a list of certified people. That's on the adminmanagement.gov website. Try to do it right the first time. Use both. Second, the readers that have been made or tested successfully as an end-to-end solution are on the APL. And there is an ordering guide on GSA.gov that talks about what has been certified as a complete end-to-end system and evaluated by the GSA evaluation program. And it also has language that covers what you said, the security functions, door contacts, door locks, video integration, and so on and so forth. And it is a template type format, so contracting officers, you out there in the contracting profession, there is a tool there for you to use that's a template. You can use what you want, take away what you don't want, and paste in what you need. And that is on the GSA.gov website. Thank you.
There's a question back here, please. One last.
Good morning. This question is for Tony. If you are bidding a project to install PACS in several different offices and you have the floor plans, what is your philosophy on site visits?
Is it a new install or a retrofit or an upgrade?
It's both.
Both?
Correct.
Okay. If it's both, then let me reference the roadmap document that was produced that basically says this is how you become FICAM compliant in a various phased approach. You get to where you want to go by starting at a starting point and then planning a strategy to get to the ending point. The survey, to me, is very important because that establishes the starting point. If you don't know where you're starting, then how can you plan a migration strategy to get efficiently and effectively to the end point? I've seen too many integrators talk to customers that to be FICAM compliant, you need to replace your system because they don't know enough to understand what might still work, what might not work that's existing. So to do it properly, you need to visit the project site and identify existing equipment, cabling infrastructure, and the environment to see whether or not the products you're going to be selecting will meet the requirements. you can look at plans and specifications for new construction. If the project is not there, obviously there's nothing to visit. So it's all being driven by plans and specs. And in that sense, you're looking at the thoroughness of the complete set of documents to see if anything was missed. And if things were missed, the proper procedure is to write an RFI. In other words, write a request for information or a question up the line to identify what you cannot see. So you're really doing a survey without going there for new construction if you do your homework first. For those that are existing, again, I would strongly recommend identifying either by a survey what's there or asking a lot of detailed questions and having them written back to you with answers so you can identify what the starting point is, what you intend to reuse, what you tend to replace, and in what order to get to the target goal.
Outstanding. Thank you all so very much. Panel, just outstanding. So much for us to chew on.